Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for December 6th, 2021. I want to begin with the report coming from both the United States and Russia that there will be a video summit tomorrow between Presidents Biden and Putin. It's set for Tuesday the 7th, 80 years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, during which ironically led to an alliance between the United States and Russia, then the USSR, to fight together in World War II. Now, this summit seems to be following a pattern that we saw previously with US and China. That in the US-China case, there had been a consistent escalation of tension over the AUKUS agreement, the Australia, UK, US agreement to provide nuclear submarines to Australia, the South China Sea confrontation, the Taiwan Strait, the US push for independence of Taiwan. All of this occurred at a point at which Biden and Xi Jinping had a more than 3-hour video conversation, which was aimed at de-escalation, where both sides agreed to have more regular contact and discussion, but the war hawks continued with their anti-China rhetoric. And so that situation remains very much unsettled. And in fact, it should be noted that there are commentators in the Defense Department who are saying that the US policy of assuming that we're either going to have a war against Russia or China are wrong, and they have to reconfigure it so the US is prepared for war with both countries. Now, what's the situation with Russia? Well, there's been a determined escalation over the situation in Ukraine, and also continued efforts to make the Nord Stream 2 pipeline a central issue of contention, not just between the US and Russia, but Europe and Russia. Now, on December 3rd, there was an intelligence leak published in the Washington Post. Sound familiar? The intelligence community using the Washington Post or the New York Times to prepare for war and chaos. In this story, they said Russia is prepared to invade Ukraine by the end of January, early February. This particular story said there were 175,000 troops, equipment, all set to go, and they're only waiting for the signal. Now, Defense Secretary Austin contributed to this in a speech he gave, I believe, Saturday at the Reagan National Defense Forum, where he said he is very concerned about Russia's intent. And he said they've invaded before. Well, what's he talking about? When did Russia invade Ukraine? The story is that Russia invaded Ukraine and to take Crimea and the Donbas region. There's no proof of that. With all the talk of Russia invading the Donbas region, there is some Russian military equipment there, but there were no Russian soldiers there. So this is part of a continuing lie. But he then went on to say the U.S. is committed to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. Well, if that's the case, what about 2014, when the U.S. spearheaded a regime change coup with the demonstrations in the Maidan Square, which were funded by people such as the State Department's Victoria Nuland, who said the U.S. put $5 billion into overthrowing the Yanukovych government, and George Soros was involved in this, among others. Where was the concern with Ukrainian sovereignty then? Now, before Austin spoke, the Army Chief of Staff, General McConville, said at the same event that the Russian troop mobilization is a threat to the, quote, security of our European friends, unquote. And at the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting last week in Riga, Latvia, General Secretary Stoltenberg of NATO consistently warned of the Russian threat, the fact that Russia may invade, and he said that it's necessary to make the costs for Russia's invasion more than the benefit they would get from winning, from succeeding. So this is the kind of war buildup that's been ongoing day after day after day leading into this summit. And of course, the media is very much involved in this with their anti-Putin line and so on. Now, also, the think tanks are full of anti-Russian propaganda. Just a couple of events in the last days. The Atlantic Council, which is a U.S.-British think tank set up in 1961 to keep the U.S. and the British allied. This is part of the Anglo-American special relationship. They claim Putin has a war obsession with Ukraine. And they do admit one thing, which is true, which I think is legitimate, which is that Putin seeks to, quote, demolish the entire rules-based order, unquote. What is the rules-based order? It's the idea of a unilateral policy orientation shaped by Washington and London on behalf of the City of London and the Wall Street banks. The rules-based order has no grounding in international law, just the demands that the world submit itself to the loss of sovereignty in favor of an Anglo-American world empire. Now, Chatham House has a story called "Is Russia Weaponizing Gas?" And this has to do with the whole Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was also taken up by lunatic neocon Max Boot in something published by the Council on Foreign Relations. When he asks the question, how do you deter Russia? He said, well, you deter Russia by making Ukraine and Georgia members of NATO. Well, Putin has said that's crossing a red line, because that means that Western troops will be moved closer to the borders of Russia, in fact, onto the borders of Russia and Ukraine and Georgia. How is that going to deter Russia? That's designed to provoke Russia. And then Boot went on to say that the other way to hurt Russia is to sanction gas from Nord Stream 2, which will hurt Russia's economy, and sell more U.S. gas to Europe. So who's weaponizing gas? That's coming from an American who writes for the Washington Post in the Council on Foreign Relations publication. So you have this media drumbeat underway. And a part of this media drumbeat is aimed at convincing the Ukrainian regime, which has neo-Nazi units embedded in the defense and security sector, that if they attack Russian ethnic population in eastern Ukraine and the Russians respond, that NATO will rush in to defend Ukraine. I don't know if people remember a 1950s movie called The Mouse That Roared, but the idea was that a poor country, by declaring war against the United States, thought the U.S. would come in and bail them out and give them money and rebuild them. This is the same kind of scenario, only this is with nuclear weapons at a moment of intense tension between so-called East and West. Now, in response to all of this, the chairman of the Russian Duma Foreign Affairs Committee denounced this as fairy tales about Russian plans to attack Ukraine. He called it fake news. And throughout the Russian government, you've had denunciation of this as a provocation. Now, ironically, all of this is occurring in the same week that Biden will be convening something called the Summit for Democracies. Now, one of the topics of the Summit for Democracies is democracy versus authoritarianism, with the U.S. model being democracy and Russia being authoritarian. And one of the things you'll hear a lot about is how Russia is trying to make it hard for people like Navalny and Russian dissidents to be involved in Russian elections. Well, perhaps you've heard New York State has just drastically increased the requirements for independent or third-party candidates to get on the ballot to make it almost impossible. Previously, it was 15,000 signatures gained in a 6-week period. It's been tripled to 45,000. This is in large part designed to keep LaRouche-supported candidate Diane Sare off the ballot for U.S. Senate, where Sare is challenging the incumbent spokesman for the deep state and the Wall Street banks, Charles Schumer. So how is it that if Russia has laws that make it harder for Navalny, that's authoritarian, but if New York State does it, it's democracy? Now, during the talks with Putin, Biden supposedly will, quote, underscore U.S. concerns with Russian military activity along the border, unquote. What about U.S. military activity along the Russian border? Well, this is how wars start. The fake propaganda builds, the drumbeat builds, and next thing you know, planes collide, or the Russian or American side see crossing into airspace as an attack and launch a strike, and next thing you know, we're in full-scale war. But why is this happening now? Well, I would argue that you have two things going on that are important. One is a series of paralyzing crises hitting the transatlantic region. Hyperinflation, the insanity of the shift to the Green New Deal, shutting down energy-efficient sources and replacing them with inefficient, costly, so-called sustainable energy. The Great Reset, which is a move to a central banker's dictatorship. And also the failure of the healthcare system under the privatization and deregulation in the face of the COVID crisis. This is go to war. Let's take the mind off all these other problems. But it also detracts from what's coming out with these leaks coming from the Durham investigation, not just leaks, but indictments, which prove that, as we warned from the beginning, the so-called Russiagate was nothing but a fraudulent attack on the Trump presidency attempting to form better relations with Vladimir Putin and Russia. So you have the same thing going on again as Durham is indicting people, showing that it was the Clinton campaign, the Obama intelligence community, in league with the British intelligence, out to sabotage the attempt to have a friendly, cooperative relationship with Russia. As that is coming out in the media, although it's not really coming out in the media, but as that is coming out, Russia becomes the enemy again because they're about to attack poor, defenseless Ukraine. So keep your eye on this. We have to make sure that we don't end up sleepwalking into World War III. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow.